Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Britain says NATO should consider removing membership action plan hurdle to Ukraine's membership bid. Russia and the West debate weapons supplies to Ukraine at Security Council. Plus, climate activist Greta Thunberg confirms environmental impact of war during Kyiv visit. Greta Thunberg condemned the environmental impact of war during the Kyiv visit. That story in the course of this edition. Thank you so much for joining us. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine should be admitted to NATO so that aggression against one or another European nation never repeats itself. Speaking as he collected an award from British think tank Chatham House, President Zelensky said the Euro-Atlantic alliance must really protect peace. The Ukrainian leader expressed confidence that his country will eventually join the NATO alliance, describing it as the legitimate recognition of Ukraine's relationship with the West.
And I believe that the day will come very, very soon when Ukrainian contribution to the global freedom and the strength of our people will be recognized by a legitimate recognition of our state, an ally of your state and all free nations, NATO members. Must honestly admit peace in Europe is the alliance, so that the aggression against one or another European nation never repeats again, and so that such self-sacrifice of soldiers is never needed again. Security institutions, in particular Euro-Atlantic institutions, must really protect peace. And now it is real. Only together with Ukraine, which will be free, strong, and of course in NATO.
Chief diplomatic advisor to Ukrainian President Ihor Zovka says that Kyiv wanted the July 11 to the 12th NATO summit in Vilnius to deliver a response to the application for NATO membership that Ukraine filed on September the 30th last year. Speaking in an interview in the Ukrainian capital, the Zelensky aide says Kyiv recognized it cannot join the 31-member bloc while Russia is waging war on Ukraine. Kyiv's allies are divided over how fast Ukraine should join NATO, and some Western governments are wary of any move that might take the alliance closer to war with Russia.
We're not asking about decision for membership to Ukraine. We do understand that the final membership of Ukraine to NATO will only happen after the victory of Ukraine, our joint victory. But what we are asking for is to start the procedure. My president, on the 30th of September, summoned an application for membership of the Secretary General of NATO. This application is now on the tables of leaders of NATO allies. So Vilnius summit would be a very good start to respond to this application. And by respond, we mean invitation for membership, which is only the first stage. When Finland and Sweden summoned an application for membership in May last year, immediately in June last year, the allies responded to the application of Sweden and Finland, inviting them.
In the meantime, British Defence Minister Ben Wallace says NATO should look at skipping the requirement for Ukraine's membership action plan as part of its pathway to joining the alliance. Mr. Wallace said he could not guarantee agreement on that step ahead of next month's NATO summit in Lithuania, but said it could be possible to remove other barriers to their membership.
members on NATO. Look, Britain's position, going right back to, I think, Bucharest, was that we believe Ukraine should be able to join NATO. Obviously, other members in the, what was less than 30 then, but a number of members had a different view, and NATO can only go forward in a unanimous position, but we started the process. That's why we were there in 2014, partly to help Ukraine's NATO capabilities build and its capacity so that it would start on that program. I think it went from associate member, and then the next discussion was membership action plan. Obviously, Sweden and Finland didn't have any of that, and I think that opens a very fair question about should at Vilnius we just skip that and say that subject to other conditions, Ukraine should be able to come in and join. You know, after all, they're going to have the most experienced land forces in Europe and probably one of the most heavily armed countries in Europe. I think we should absolutely look at skipping the membership action plan. But of course, we have to put some realism in this space that there are 31 members of NATO now, and you know, we have to all move together. But yes, the direction of travel should be towards NATO membership, but I can't promise that at the Vilnius summit you're going to resolve those 31. What I think we could be able to do is remove more barriers for Ukraine so that when this is over, Ukraine moves towards more security guarantees, more support.
Joining us now is security expert Mr. Chidi Nwanu, who joins us virtually from London. Thank you for making out the time to be with us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
In the non-ratification of the bid of Ukraine for NATO, it appears these countries are trying to avoid, is it that they are trying to avoid an Archduke Ferdinand situation that triggered World War I, where one nation was offended, one declared war on the other. It became one that involved very quickly Austria, Russia, Great Britain, and we've alluded to that in our report. Is that the reason, the main reason why these nations don't want Ukraine to join NATO at this time with this conflict with Russia?
I mean, the key reason why Ukraine can't join NATO now is because it is in the middle of a conflict and it has numerous territorial disputes. So one of the sacrosanct kind of conditions of NATO's membership is that you cannot have any internal conflicts or external conflict. So clearly, the fact that it's at war with Russia is a big no-no. But even prior to that, 2014 time, the war in Donbass made it impossible for Ukraine to join Russia. At the same time, the fact that Russia has annexed Crimea means it has a contested territory, which again prevents it from joining NATO. So all of these factors are put in place to prevent NATO from being dragged into a pre-existing war, and also to ensure that a country that is joining NATO, you know, for the purposes of the alliance, you know, a mutual defense pact, rather than joining NATO to fight its wars. So Ukraine cannot join NATO until this war is resolved, and I would say Ukraine most likely will most likely never join NATO unless, you know, Russia is comprehensively defeated and there is some sort of a peace agreement and the status of Crimea is resolved amicably. So there will. What we're seeing is a lot of posturing, and a mechanism will be formed whereby Ukraine has the security guarantees of NATO, but it will not be a member. But even when you look back to prior to 2014 and the initial Russian invasion, Ukraine still couldn't join NATO because, again, part of the conditions of joining NATO is that there have to be certain reforms to your military, to your political system. The civilian control of the military has to be clearly laid out and defined. There has to be significant anti-corruption measures put in place, and Ukraine hadn't fulfilled any of those conditions pre-2014 or even post-2014. So the problem, so the discussion of Ukraine joining NATO even before the invasion and before the war was just a non-starter. It was never going to happen, and now it's still not going to happen for a long time. But what you will see in Vilnius is significant security guarantees being given to Ukraine. That, much like before the start of this phase of the war, when the West guaranteed that it will help Ukraine defend itself, you will see something similar being given to Ukraine.
Then that is quite different from the situation of Sweden, who are also trying to join NATO and whose bid is not being ratified by Hungary nor Turkey, correct?
Yes, that. So Sweden is a completely different kettle of fish. Sweden is essentially a NATO member in name and everything but name. So Sweden's armed forces are very much aligned with NATO. They train to NATO standards. Their equipment is NATO standard. They've been training with NATO forces for a long time. Their command systems are well known. They have they've ticked every single procedural box. The problem that is holding them up is just the ratification of Turkey, because they have a bilateral problem with Turkey. It's unlikely that Sweden will join because the Turks seem to be holding out quite strongly, and the Swedes do not want to give up their reputation for, sheltering refugees or political asylum seekers. So it seems like there is an impasse there. Sweden most likely won't be able to join for a while, but what you will see is, again, there are already mechanisms in place, joint command networks set up between the two countries. So it's between the countries and the alliance. So you're likely to see Sweden operating as a virtual member of NATO, but not an official member of NATO.
President Zelensky has said that the path to victory will be difficult. This is in the light of the counteroffensive that has been taken on by the Ukrainian troops post the Wagner dispersal. What is your assessment of the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian troops?
So, I mean, I don't think the Wagner issue has affected the counteroffensive other than causing a dislocation in the Russian command element. So the offensive in of itself, away from the Wagner drama, is proceeding slowly and very painfully for the Ukrainians. They're taking quite heavy casualties. The Russians are fighting well. They're fighting a good defensive battle in a manner that you would have expected them to have fought originally. A defensive battle is easier to fight than in an offensive battle, as we can see from the Russian offensive operations. The beginning of the war, that kind of maneuver warfare was difficult for them. But a defensive battle, you're sitting in one location, and your only maneuver elements are your counterattacks. So it favors the Russians, their way of war, the level of training they've given their soldiers, and the equipment that they've got. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have to fight a very brutal break-in battle. That's where we are now. They have to break into the Russians' defense positions. Now, most of the fighting is taking place in what is known as the Grey Zone, which is the area which in layman's parlance would be called no man's land, the area between the Ukrainian lines and the Russian lines. Now, if the Ukrainians want to defeat the Russians, they have to get into the Russian main lines, break out, and then push round into their rear. That's not happening. But what you've seen in the past few weeks is the Ukrainians have changed tack, and they are now fighting heavily in that grey zone, in that no man's land. And part of what you would assess is part of the reason they're doing that is to force the Russians to fight in that area and use up their reserves and unmask their guns and their command posts and their artillery. And what you're seeing now is a lot of strikes by the Ukrainians on Russian command posts, on Russian artillery, on Russian air defense. So these things don't necessarily tell you who's winning or losing. I don't think we're in a winning or losing point right now, but I think both sides are fighting quite well and quite hard, and it's a fairly brutal battle. But for context, if you look back at other battles, like the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa in 1942, it took weeks before the British broke through the German lines. Same with the Battle of Normandy. It took weeks before the British broke through the German lines, or the Americans broke through the German lines. So there's no expectation in combined arms maneuver that there'll be a great breakthrough. It would be nice to see. But this is this kind of grinding battle that, war between two enemies who are more or less evenly matched. This is how it looks. It's just horrible, brutal fighting. To go back to the Wagner issue, what you've seen there is how it affects the operational side of life is now you can see there's an issue in the Russian command element where generals are being investigated. There's a lot of suspicion. What this is going to do eventually is going to cause a kind of freeze of command decisions. When crucial moments come up where you need commanders to make decisions, because they're now being checked for their loyalty to Putin, those decisions are going to be based on, is this going to get me in trouble or not? So it's likely there will be a dividend for Ukraine from this confusion caused by Wagner, but it's not likely we're going to see it yet. But I think there will be a problem for the Russians, especially if some of their best generals like Surovikin are the ones being pulled out.
Indeed, it appears both sides are in it for the long haul. Thank you for your opinions and insight, Mr. Chidi Nwanu, a security expert who joined us virtually from London. Much appreciated.
Thanks for your time.
European Union leaders are gathering to discuss the aborted mutiny in Russia and debate what role the EU could play in the long-term Western commitment to bolster Ukraine's security. Arriving for a summit in Brussels, the leaders said they remain committed to supporting Ukraine in the war triggered by Russia's invasion of its neighbor in February last year. The two-day summit is a regular gathering of the EU's 27 national leaders with a range of topics including migration, economic security, and relations with China, all on the agenda.
Putin goes out of this crisis weakened, but a weaker Putin is a greater danger. So we have to be very much aware of the consequences. Everything remains unclear what has happened, who were behind this attempt of military upheaval, military rebellion. Some generals have been arrested, so I suppose that Putin will be in a cleaning mood internally and a more assertive mood.
The mutiny we saw at the weekend demonstrates that there are cracks and divisions within the Russian system. At the same time, it is important to underline that these are internal Russian matters, and it's too early to draw any final conclusions, also because it's not yet clear how many of the Wagner forces that will end up in Belarus or other places. What matters for NATO is that we will continue to support Ukraine.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has declined to answer questions about Russian General Sergei Surovikin, whose status and location have not been made public since an abortive armed mercenary mutiny last Saturday. Nicknamed General Armageddon by the Russian press for his aggressive tactics in the Syrian conflict, Surovikin, who is deputy commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, has been absent from view since Saturday when he appeared in a video appealing to mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin to halt his mutiny. He looked exhausted in that video, and it was unclear if he was speaking under duress. There have been since unconfirmed reports that he has been questioned by the security services in Russia. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov referred questions about Surovikin to the defense ministry, which has so far not made any statement about him. Warnings were issued in the United Nations Security Council yesterday that weapons transfers amidst fighting between Ukraine and Russia could fall into wrong hands. Speaking before the Security Council, the Under-Secretary General and High Representative for the Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu, listed pre-transfer diversion risk assessment and user certificates and non-tree transfer clauses as methods to prevent weapons from falling into the wrong hands. Ukraine, which has been fighting Russian forces since Moscow began its full-scale invasion in February 2022, depends heavily on Western military aid and weapons supplies.
Transfers have included heavy conventional weapons, including battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircrafts, helicopters, large-caliber artillery systems, missile systems and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions, small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There are reports that the supply of arms and ammunition has accelerated and expanded ahead of the reported counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces. There are also reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons, such as uncrewed combat aerial vehicles and ammunition, to the Russian armed forces for use in Ukraine. Measures to address the risk of diversion to unauthorized end users and for unauthorized users are essential for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such measures include pre-transfer diversion risk assessments, end user certificates, and non-retransfer clauses, effective legal and enforcement measures, and post-shipment verifications.
Last June, the head of Interpol warned that the massive transfers of arms into Ukraine means, quote, we can expect an influx of weapons in Europe and beyond, and that criminals are now, as we speak, focusing on them.
I urge those who seem to be concerned about weapon transfers to conflict zones not to forget the difference between the aggressor and the defender who fights to survive. At the same time, I cannot but note that the issue of illicit arms trafficking in and out of Russia appears to be more than pertinent and timely following the weekend's events in Russia.
We are committed to ensuring Ukraine has the ability to exercise its right to self-defense against Russia's illegal and brutal war, while working with Ukraine to maintain the highest safeguards to ensure the weapons its partners provide are not diverted into unintended hands. We will continue to stress accountability, as we have from the beginning of this conflict, and continue to ensure robust processes to counter attempts at illicit diversion.
Of Ecuador for their statement.
After the break, IMF board completes Ukraine loan review, allowing $890 million withdrawal. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The Pentagon says it is not aware of any imminent decision about the provision of attack long-range missiles to Ukraine following a news report from the Wall Street Journal suggesting Washington was close to providing them to Kyiv. Kyiv has long sought the U.S. Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, arguing the missiles will help them hit the Russian forces far behind the front lines. Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Patrick Ryder told the news briefing in his words, I don't have anything to announce regarding ATACMS, and certainly I'm not aware of any imminent decisions as it relates to ATACMS. Former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, who is running for the Republican nomination in the 2024 presidential election, made a surprise visit to Ukraine yesterday to meet the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Mr. Pence vowed to keep providing Ukraine with the support they need for the duration of the conflict. He also made visits to 3 cities and villages near Kyiv, Bucha, Irpin, and Moshun to see the destruction from Russian shelling since the invasion in February last year. Pence is the first Republican presidential candidate to meet Zelensky during the campaign.
As I learned from President Zelensky and his security team, the Ukrainian military is making steady advances against the Russians. And I assured him that for my part, we'll continue to do everything in our power to make sure that we provide the Ukrainian military with the support they need until they repel the Russian invasion and restore the sovereignty of this country. And I have every confidence that the day will come when Ukraine's sovereignty is restored, their territorial integrity is restored. And in that moment, I believe we'll not only have served the interests of the people of Ukraine, but I truly believe it's in the national interest of the United States and all of the free world that the Ukrainian military prevail. We need to make sure that we provide the Ukrainian military what they need to push back on and defeat Russian aggression here, because it will make it clear to Russia, to China, and to any other nations in the world that would seek to redraw international lines by force, that the free world will not stand for it. The free world will stand together for freedom. Russia has gone from being the second most powerful military in the world to being the second most powerful military in Ukraine. That's real progress on a strategic level.
Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has visited Kyiv to draw attention to environmental damage caused by war in Ukraine and criticized the world's response to the June 6 collapse of the vast hydroelectric Kakhovka Dam. She was welcomed by the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky together with an international working group on environmental damage Russia caused in Ukraine. President Zelensky thanked the group for the visit, saying it was an important signal.
It's really a very important signal of supporting Ukraine. It's very important, and really we need your help, your professional help. And I spoke with my team. You had a good conversation, and thank you very much for video format, which we had together. Yeah, so it's very important to have this. You made the decision about this compact of very concrete steps. Been there in Kherson region, in Mykolaiv region, and a lot of cities. I think you had meeting. I think you know that a lot of cities which are not even there, they have critical problem with drinking water. Yes. Technical water is also a big problem for agricultures of Ukraine, not only for Ukraine, because we have to give this wheat and corn to give to Africa and Asia countries. Really give sometimes, because we don't sell. Some countries don't have possibility. Yeah. So we need it, and this technical water is crucial important of Ukraine, not only for Ukraine, because we have to give.
President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. Meanwhile, the country is investigating the dam blast which unleashed floods across southern Ukraine and Russian-occupied areas of the Kherson region as a war crime and possible criminal environmental destruction or ecocide. It has estimated the cost of the dam's collapse at 1.2 billion euros. Kyiv and Russia have blamed each other for the dam's destruction.
Ecocide and environmental destruction is a form of warfare, as Ukrainians by this point know all too well, and so does Russia. And that's why they are deliberately targeting the environment and people's livelihoods and homes, and therefore also destroying lives. Because this is, after all, a matter of people. It is about people, it is about Ukrainians suffering from this war. It is also of everyone else suffering from the consequences. For example, the millions of people dependent on food grown in Ukraine, just as one example. I think that no one of us remains unbothered while seeing the horrific developments that are taking place now in Ukraine and the crimes committed by Russia. And I hope that we can gather the assessments from local NGOs, from the scientific community, from authorities and so on, to create assessments of the environmental damages that are happening, and so that we can create accountability, so that Russia is held accountable for its actions and its crimes, and so that the affected people can have a possibility to recover, and that Ukraine can reconstruct. Atrocities, they leave us at loss for words. I think it's hard to react to these things that are actually happening, especially for people who aren't experiencing it firsthand. So I think we need to make more room for people who are affected by these catastrophes to tell their stories and to share information of what's happening on the ground.
If something happened in Zaporizhia, it will be many, many times bigger than the catastrophe in Chernobyl. And of course, Ukraine, we are talking about it every day. Presidents talking in all platforms, and with Mr. Grossi, and with all of the world leaders, that still the station will be controlled by military people from Russia and not back to the control of to Ukraine, because it's our territory. It's now occupied. It will be big concern and big risk for whole the world.
We deal with three existential threats, as we call them: the nuclear threat, the climate and nature crisis, and the pandemic crisis. And when the site was invaded, the elders issued a strong statement of our concern. But I have to say, when I saw the full briefing this morning, the situation is much more precarious than we had even imagined. And I go back to my fellow elders, and with the influence that the elders will want to have within the UN and elsewhere, to really join with the government here in emphasizing how serious this is and how precarious. It was.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army have announced that people living in the northeast region of Sumy should evacuate due to constant Russian shelling. Lieutenant General Serhiy Nayev wrote on Telegram, "I call on everyone, please flee to save your lives." He says local authorities were helping with the evacuation. He also added that Russia was using rocket launchers, artillery and glide bombs in the area on a daily basis. He noted that the section remains the most dangerous in the northern area of operations. Spain will take on EU's rotating presidency this weekend, with the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez visiting Kyiv to show steadfast European support for Ukraine. According to a statement, Sanchez says they will kick off the EU presidency on Saturday, July the 1st, in Ukraine to demonstrate with his presence the unfaltering European Union support to the country. The announcement was made as Sanchez attended an EU summit in Brussels, during which President Zelensky, participating via video link, confirmed the visit. The International Monetary Fund's Executive Board has completed its first review of Ukraine's $15.6 billion loan program, allowing Kyiv to immediately withdraw $890 million for budget support. The board's approval brings Ukraine's withdrawals under the program launched on March 31st to about $3.6 billion so far. The IMF says Ukrainian authorities have made strong progress towards meeting reform commitments under challenging conditions, meeting quantitative performance criteria through April and structural benchmarks through the end of June. When we return, Russians buy Wagner merchandise after abortive mutiny. That's in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. And to our final stretch of today's edition of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll turn our attention to the pecuniary and business issues concerning this war. Ini John Mekwa is with us in the studio. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, in spite of Russia's oil export rebounding in March, that is, Russia's oil export rebounded in March and April in spite of the price cap.
Yes.
How did they maneuver that situation?
Well, you know, we've talked a lot about bits and pieces of this. We've talked about how it seems like the areas like Europe and the United States, where they have vowed not to use anything coming from Russia, they indirectly, secondary traders or secondary consumers, are still using some of this. Well, that's part of it. So in December last year, there was a price cap that Russian oil should not be sold beyond $60 for a barrel. Guess what? Sometime this week, even WTI was about $60. This morning, it recovered a bit. It was about 74. That's for 70 for WTI and Brent at 74. So what's happening is that in spite of the fact that there's supposed to be a price cap.
Who's placing the cap?
Oh, it was the United States. So they call themselves the Price Cap Coalition.
Okay.
And they're composed of Australia, Canada, the EU, Japan, UK, and the United States.
In other words, the countries are not on exactly good terms with Russia.
Obviously. That was the whole essence of it. You know, to reduce the power, the financial power of Russia from funding the war. But it seems it's not really working out as they planned. So we see that as of May 2023, Russia had made about 570.7 billion rubles from oil. It's not as much as it was last year, because May 2022, they had about 886 billion. So it's not as much, but that's still a whole lot, you know, that they have made. And for April itself, it was 747.5 billion rubles that they had made from oil and gas. This is a lot of money. I don't know how many countries, you know, earn this much of money when you talk about just less than maybe about 5 months in a year. And this is a country that's supposed to be under sanctions. So what's going on really? Why does it look like the price cap is not effective? Number one, when you look at, remember that we talked about how Russia is asking that their food and fertilizers should be exported, not because there's a ban on it, but because insurance companies and all of that will not touch those fertilizer and food coming from Russia, you know, because of the fear of secondary sanction. It seems when it comes to oil and gas, the tankers that are transporting oil and gas from Russia to other countries are insured by European Union countries.
Okay.
And these are the same people who are placing the price cap and the ban and all of that. You know, so some analysts are saying that...
So they're picking up the losses. That's what insurance is. They're picking up the losses that Russia... And they're paying them?
No, okay, so for there to be a transaction to start with, you know, these are very huge, expensive transactions when you talk about crude oil being moved on the water. So there's always an insurance, paperwork and all of that from the destination to the location, you know, where it's going to and all of that. So there's always insurance. There has to be insurance, just like you're traveling now.
Yeah,
you know, you fill your ticket, you pay for insurance and all of that. So this obviously has to be insured. Every transaction is insured because you don't know what's going to happen and there's a lot of money involved. So you want to take care of that. You have companies that are logistics, you know, that own the ship, that take care of the ship, all those kind of things, you know. Now, what has been discovered is because if any Russian ship, but in this case it's tankers anyway, is on the road, if any Russian register, remember we talked about how countries like Poland, I think Hungary, have closed their borders. They don't want any articulated vehicle coming from Russia or Belarus. So there's no way those tankers can come from Russia, you know, to pass through and all of that. But of course, if it has the papers from Europe, then it can go through.
So they still have those papers?
Yeah, of course they have the papers. They are European insured companies, but the content in them is Russian crude. And perhaps they've not thought of that. So people are saying if you really want to enforce, you know, this crude oil, stopping them and not allowing Russia to make some money, then, first of all, you may have to stop in totality the movement of crude via land through tankers. And that's a whole lot. Because guess what? These European companies are making money from Russia by operating here. And there are individuals involved, there are companies involved. You know, so when you just wake up and stop that, of course, you're stopping your country, you know, from making some money, or some of your clients or your citizens from making money. That's on the one side. Now, on the other side is the price of oil has been very volatile, you know, in recent times. Sometimes you've had oil up to $60. Now, so what is the essence? Because the discouragement was supposed to be that Russian oil will be cheap, so cheap, you know, that even when they sell a lot, they won't make a lot of money. But now, when you have the price cap at almost the same level with the international benchmark, then it really doesn't make any difference. So if you really want to make an impact, then you should put the price cap at $30.
Is that realistic? What a dilemma. Let's move on from there. Russia continues to be the cat with 9 lives in that regard. But as far as the ruble goes, another slump. How much? By how much this time around?
The target is that the ruble should be about 90, you know, for $1 and all of that. But it's slumped. But, you know, it's better to understand why. And the reason is they just ended the tax payment month or season. So because taxes are paid in rubles, so when they're paying the taxes, there's high demand for the ruble. And so that gives value to the ruble, because when demand is higher than supply, then of course there's going to be. So they just ended that. So it's a drop. I think about yesterday, it dropped about 1.5 or 1.4%.
So that's not too much.
Well, it's not too much. When you talk about currency, that's a whole lot. When you lose more than 1%, that's a lot, you know. Because it went as down as 70 for for a dollar and all of it. So that's down. But understanding that is because it was boosted by the tax payment period, and that period just ended. Then you may not get so excited that they're actually losing. It might just be, the ruble is settling after so much demand on it, at the end of the day.
Okay, so in the global power play for monetary superiority, Hungary has rejected the European Commission's plans to grant more money to whom?
To Ukraine.
To Ukraine?
Yes.
Okay, so they keep being the wrench in the works of Ukraine.
Yeah, well, they have their reasons. In this case now, they're saying that it's Poland and Hungary. They were supposed to have a relief fund, the EU. They were supposed to have a relief fund worth about $50 billion, where after COVID, because of what countries had gone through, they were supposed to use that to give them some relief. And they're saying they have not received theirs. And Poland has also not received theirs. So why should they keep on just spending money? Ukraine is in need. We're also in need. And, we've talked about how the farmers around this country are feeling the pinch because Ukrainian wheat is ending up just around them there. It's depriving them of revenue, and now you still want us to contribute to, aiding Ukraine. And they're saying, well, we have to think of ourselves first before we can start talking about helping another country.
And finally, speaking of wheat supply, Russia is controlling more.
Yeah, they have the control more now. So July starts tomorrow. In about 16 days, that's about 2 weeks or so, the grain deal ends. But we've talked about how even as it is active now, there's been some hurdles, to the implementation of it. And of course, the people affected most are the Ukrainians. Ukraine market is being affected. So what happens? People turn to Russia because Russia has other avenues. You have China, you have India, you even have some African countries that are turning to Russia for wheat. And even the market that used to be for Ukraine, because Ukraine cannot get its wheat outside through the Black Sea. They're only getting, bits of it through countries, the European countries, the Poland and the Hungary and all of that. So their production or their exports of this wheat has reduced.
So this non-renewal of the Black Sea grain deal will leave Russia smelling like roses.
Obviously, because they have other ways of sending it out, and Ukraine doesn't. And on the other hand, a lot. I mean, you just read of how a part of Ukraine, the president or the presidency is telling people to leave that area, because there are field mines everywhere. Farmers cannot go to the farm, so their production has dropped. But even the little that they're able to produce cannot be sent out because people are not so sure of Russia's stance. Well, they should be sure by now because I think President Putin has not been quiet about his grievances with the grain deal. So even when it's active, there's no assurance of safety, So not to mention when it expires in a couple of weeks, where will they get it through? And these other countries, the European countries, they do not have the capacity to transport a huge amount of Ukrainian wheat, or not just with grains generally, across to other parts of the world.
Right. So more news, analysis, and information from Ini John Mekwa on Business Morning after this program. Ini, many thanks.
Thank you.
Pope Francis's envoy to Russia, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, held a service to celebrate the holiday of St. Peter and Paul in Moscow's Cathedral of Immaculate Conception. It was the second day of Zuppi's peace visit. Earlier in the day, he met for talks with Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill. Zuppi stressed that Pope Francis was very keen to hear directly Kirill's views on the Ukraine situation. He discussed the humanitarian issues related to the conflict in Ukraine and the protection of Human Rights with Russia's Children's Commissioner Maria Vova-Belova. The International Criminal Court in March issued an arrest warrant for both her and for President Vladimir Putin, accusing them of the war crime of illegal deportation of hundreds of children from Ukraine. Moscow says the warrants were legally void, as Russia was not a member of the ICC. It also denies accusations of human rights abuse in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the head of Russia's Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, told an envoy of Pope Francis that their children should work together to avert negative political developments and serve the cause of peace and justice. Kirill, who is a strong supporter of President Vladimir Putin's decision to send troops into Ukraine, was speaking to the papal envoy, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, during talks in Moscow. He was quoted as saying, "A very big problem arose in relationships between Russia and the West when we faced a lot of tension in political relationships and in threats of a big military conflict happening. It is very important for all the forces that are interested in maintaining peace and justice to unite in order to prevent these events from happening." He also added, at times of the Cold War, there was more dialogue than now. Now that the war is more tense, we need more dialogue, not less. As Christians, we need to help each other to understand how to act. And finally, on the program this morning, online prices for merchandise bearing the insignia of Russia's Wagner Group, a human skull against a black and red backdrop, have shot up since its abortive armed mutiny, with buyers posting 5-star reviews and support for the merchandise. Mercenary Chief Yevgeny Prigozhin sent an armed convoy on a 1,200-kilometer charge towards Moscow in protest over what he says was the incompetence and corruption, in his words, of Russia's military leadership. A deal brokered by the leader of Belarus abruptly halted the mutiny late on Saturday. E-commerce leader Wildberry's weekly price breakdown showed how costs have risen. A patch depicting the skull that can be sewn onto clothes fetched 525 rubles in the period June 25th to 29th, up sharply from 294 rubles during June 18th to the 25th. Prices for a black T-shirt emblazoned with a picture of Wagner fighter holding a violin jumped this week to a 1,650 ruble price from 1,236 on a review of a Wagner flag on Wildberries. One buyer, named Vladimir, says, "The Wagner private military company is the best. Good luck to you guys. The flag is excellent." The Wagner fighters have spearheaded some of Russia's military actions in Ukraine, were cheered enthusiastically by residents in Rostov-on-Don on Saturday when they briefly took control of the southern Russian city. President Vladimir Putin described the action as treason and a stab in the back. By the way, Wagner is named after a musician, a classical musician in the ilk of Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, and those sorts of people. And that's it on our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thanks for watching.